Hello, everybody. We'll try to make sure that this is not going to be a shaggy dog story. And as we've only got 25 minutes, there'll be no horsing around. And we'll probably have to cut a long tail short. Boom, boom. Oh. But we have a cracking story to tell about a 1 in a million find that was discovered 72 years ago and has been in the national collections for 64 years, but whose national and international significance has only recently become clear, thanks to new research. We'll be talking about a unique late Bronze Age hat made from horsehair hair that was found at Kirtomy in the far north of Scotland, very close to what's now the North Coast 500 route. It was found in 1953. Donald John Mackay was out digging peats here on the Chalcolithic estate near Kirtomy in Sutherland, accompanied by his daughter Babette, who was just 10 years old, when his spade hit something that was clearly not peat at a depth of about 4 feet, just over a metre. Eagle-eyed Babette spotted it as a mass of hair, and DJ bent down, took a closer look, and decided it looked like a hat, rather like a straw boater in shape. Unfortunately, his peat spade had distorted it, but he smoothed it out and took it back to the local schoolhouse where he lived. It started to fall apart, but he notified the local schoolmaster in Betty Hill, Donald MacLeod, who eventually drew it to the attention of staff in the then-named National Museum of Antiquaries of Scotland, who acquired it from DJ in 1961, as we know from an entry in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Photographs taken at the time show that it did indeed look like a mass of bound hair held together by peat. And here you can see views taken from the top on the left and from the underside on the right. Now, were this to fall into the hands of someone who knew nothing about ancient textiles, this could have been a spaghetti-like disaster in the making. But thanks to the fact that the late, great Audrey Henschel was a curator at NMAS at that time, it meant that it was in safe hands. Audrey took a close interest in ancient textiles, having published on the subject in the 1950s, and she immediately recognized this object as a hat, even though, in her words, it was in a confused and dilapidated state, aren't we all? With her characteristic thoroughness, she took detailed notes and measurements, as you can see here, and she proceeded to undertake a forensic deconstruction of this mass, starting at the top, where she was able to recognize the dense coils belonging to the crown of the hat. Each coil consisted of a cord comprising around 12 to 15 hairs, bound around with a further hair. At the top right, you can see the spiral at the very center of the crown, with an interesting gap in its center, the significance of which Lilja will be explaining later. Audrey also came across some long strands that seemed to go right round the bundle of hair, and she wondered whether these might potentially be strings for tying the hat onto the head. The next layer down consisted of a hoop made up of numerous cords. This band had been squashed flat, but as its diameter seemed to decrease from the top down, she realized it would originally have sloped inwards slightly. As she worked, Audrey had to use thin bits of metal wire to preserve the structure, as otherwise the individual cords would have fallen apart. It was only peat holding them together. She also used colored cotton to indicate where the various parts of the hat articulated with each other. At the bottom of the heap were 2 further hoops, larger in diameter, and Audrey was able to identify these as the top and bottom of the brim of the hat. By having 2 such layers, the brim would have looked neat and tidy, whether you're looking at it from above or from below. Based on her observations and measurements, Audrey was able to make a full-sized paper mock-up of how she thought the hat might have looked. She said the crown could have been flat or slightly peaked, as shown here, and the wall below it sloped in. The brim then sloped down and out, and this would have afforded shade from the sun. Audrey also worked out that there must have been an organic infrastructure to which the individual cords had been bound, but which had perished away completely in the peat. She could tell from her measurements that it must have consisted of strands running transversely to the cords, with a diameter of 1.5 to 2 millimeters. You can just about see them in red on her drawing. And fine straw, or something like that, seemed to be the most obvious substance that would fit the bill. She also realized that the single or double hairs used to bind the bundles of hair together into a coil must also have passed under this infrastructural material, thereby binding the coils to it. And at the bottom of this slide, you can see the knots at each end of at the end of each coil. These were tucked neatly below the surface so they wouldn't have been visible when the hat was worn. Audrey drew on the expertise of fibre specialist Michael Ryder, who confirmed that the hairs were from the tail of a horse, and so she started to look for comparable items elsewhere. Audrey did this work late in 1961 and early 1962, and it's clear from her notes that she was intending to write them up into an article for the proceedings, but this never happened. It's most likely that the bulk of Audrey's time, in addition to her day job, was taken up with preparing the first volume of her magisterial survey of the chambered cairns of Scotland, which was published in 1963. The hat was put away in the store, along with her notes, and there it lay, with nothing happening until 2014, when the contents of the store were being moved. Audrey had had no idea of how old the hat was, so it had been put into the part of the store where medieval and recent finds were kept. But one of the curatorial assistants drew my attention to it and asked if it should go into the pre-medieval part of the store. My interest was piqued because there is another item that's made using horsehair in the museum's collections. It's from Cheshire in Lewis, and it's called the Cheshire Thing. As we don't know exactly what it is, answers on a postcard, please. My colleague Trevor Cowie jokingly suggested it could be a chastity belt for a sheep. And it consists of matted cattle hair, twisted wool, and braided horsehair. And I'd got a radiocarbon date that placed this firmly in the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Curious to see whether the Kirtomy hat might be of the same vintage, I therefore arranged for a hair from that to be radiocarbon dated. And as you can see, it turns out that the hat is indeed roughly contemporary with the Cheshire Thing and is roughly 3,000 years old, just a little bit earlier than the Rosemarkie hoard. This makes both objects really significant because this is among the earliest evidence for the presence of domestic horse in Britain and Ireland. We can now say, thanks to a growing number of radiocarbon dates, that horses were not one of the novelties introduced from the continent during the Chalcolithic period by the Beaker people, as had previously been assumed. Rather, the earliest evidence dates to the Middle Bronze Age, as you can see from this Bayesian-modelled date estimate. And although we call them horses, in fact, they would have been pony-sized, like these examples, the conic horse on the left from the continent, and the Exmoor and New Forest ponies that you see on the right. Even more interestingly, the period when the Kirtomy hat was used is a time when we see horse gear appearing in metalwork hoards, as in this recent find, the Peebles hoard, which my colleague Dr. Matt Knight is working on just now. This suggests that horses were used to draw posh vehicles of some kind, complete with their equivalent of jingle bells attached to their cheek pieces. And if horses were used in that way, you would need to trim their tails so they didn't get caught up, hence the availability of tail hair. In 2024, research stepped up a gear. I thought, hang on a minute, let's not put the cart in front of the horse here. Let's double check that it really is horsehair. And so I put a strand under the museum's Whizzy microscope to measure its width. And also our chums in York University kindly did Zoom's proteomic analysis, and this confirmed that it is indeed horsehair, and we know it's from the tail. To take things further, I decided it was time to bring the big guns in, as it were. And so that is how Susanna and Lilja got involved. I'll now hand over to Susanna to describe what she did and what she found out.
The technical investigation of the method of manufacture showed that Audrey Henshaw was on the right track. She made some excellent observation. These groups of around 8 to 19 horsehairs were knotted together, and this makes these long strands. And these bundles are around 2 to 3 millimeters wide. Single or double horsehairs, as you can see in this image, wrapped around to bind them, and there are the missing plant fibre warp. So this can be identified as a technique called wrapped twining, and this is a really unusual basketry technique. It belongs to a technology called twining, which was important in Bronze Age Britain. But the late Bronze Age twining, up till recently, has been quite elusive, and until really the important discovery of Must Farm, where there's an assemblage of twining from plant fibres. So we can see in this diagram, the blue arrow, this is showing you the direction of those horsehair bundles with the single or double horsehairs twisted round. But what's missing are the vertical strands in the diagram, the warp, and this is the joining factor that holds them together. And the reason this is missing is because of the soil chemistry. Plant fibres don't survive well in these conditions. And this is the absence of these vertical elements is also the reason it's falling apart, because there's just nothing in that structure to hold it together. So this is what we call a basketry technique. It's not a textile as such. A textile's woven on a loom, but it's closely related and obviously made from fibre. It also has this wrapped twining technique, which we don't find anywhere else in Britain, and I'm not aware of it being found in the Bronze Age in other parts of Europe. It has a front and back, so there's a distinct difference between the two sides. The very exciting thing about the Kirtomy hat is that it's Scotland's earliest recognisable garment, and that's something that has a shape and style. We found a number of other fragments. Okay, these materials are very rare, but there are fragments even of twining, but none of them have this idea of the shape and style to be interpreted as a recognisable garment. This example of open twining from Langwell was found in the head and leg area of an inhumation in a kist. And this may have been some kind of matting or cover or even some kind of garment, but we don't have enough details to understand the shape and style like we do for the Kirtomy hat. Likewise, there are braids, furs and cords roughly contemporary with the hat. Not necessarily garments. We've heard about the Shashada thing. And there's also textiles. This is a woven flax or nettle textile found inside the socket of a late Bronze Age spearhead at Pyat Dykes. So the Kirtomy hat is the earliest recognisable garment in Scotland, but were there other garments? It's difficult to say. There is a wonderful example of a textile with a decorative leather edge found from White Horse Hill Kist in Devon. This is woven again with plant fibres, thought to be nettle, with a calfskin edging with little decorative triangles. So this gives us an idea that people weren't looking dirty and ragged. I mean, these things look brown because they've been in the soil, but people were making beautiful fabrics. What about the comparanda then for the horsehair? This woven band with tassel comes from Cromer in Northern Ireland and comes from a hoard. It shows this fabulous work with horsehair, and Elizabeth Wincott Heckett worked out that 2,000 horsehairs were necessary to make that tassel at the end. It's associated with a wool textile, which could have formerly been a garment. It gives us some idea of the textures and materials people were weaving at the time. It's a little bit later than the date from Kirtomy. There are other comparanda for the use of long animal hairs. Again, at White Horse Hill, there's a cattle hair armband with tin studs. From the same site, a basket was decorated on the rim with cattle hair, and in the replica you can see the dark and light pattern that would have caused. Some comparanda with other hats. From Newstead, there's a Roman hat made out of hair moss. It looks like a twining technique as well. From the Danish log coffin burials, known for their garments, there are these fake fur hats. These are made from woven textiles and covered all over with little fibres with bubbles at the end, creating a fluffy appearance. And then there are also the Phrygian hats with this hooked shape. These are from the areas of what's now Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. And their appearance with a distinctive shape, for example, here and in other iconography, shows just how important items like hats were as items of personal identity. They're very close to the face, and so people see hats, hairstyles, pay attention to them when they're looking at people. So I'll pass back to Alison.
Thank you. So the next obvious step in our work on the Kirtomy hat was to get a reconstruction made, and this is where Lilja comes in. And as Diana said, Lilja is an historical costumier who, among other many fantastic achievements, has done costumes for Outlander. But first, we had to procure horse or ponytail hair, and that's where Miri and Casper come in. Miri lives in Wiltshire and is owned by a pal of mine, Julie Gardner, and she, Miri that is, kindly allowed us to use a little bit of her tail in exchange for a Waitrose carrot. She was also sent Waitrose sugar cubes, but apparently horse dentists, vets I think is the name of them, don't allow them to eat this anymore. How dull. The horse on the right is the lovely Casper, owned by Nicole Petrie, who is no longer with us, but Nicole kindly allowed his tail to be used. In life, apparently, he had a fetish for hats, so he would go up, if you were wearing a hat, he would come. So it's very, very fitting that he's ended up as one. Anyway, over to Lilja, who's going to tell us how she's made a reconstruction.
To make this hat, we first started with everything that we actually knew. So went through Order's Note. Me and Susanna had a proper close look at the actual pieces of the hat at the museum. And what then happened was that I did a lot of experimentation, because obviously we didn't know what the organic material was. We assumed straw, mostly for ease of access. It's something you can buy hat making straw today, and it fits the right size for the measurements that we took for what the loops around the hat is. So to create this, I started with looking at basketry techniques rather than hat making techniques. Usually a hat making from most eras, know nothing about this era's hat making, because this is the only one, would be braided. The straw would be braided. But for this, the straw is only the internal structure, and it is the horsehair that is the actual decorative outside nice look of it. So I started with what's called a spider. It is just a couple woven straws together. This creates 16 little sticky outy bits. Very scientific of me. And then I started trying to figure out how to create this like little rounded weaving around the straw. So I took a bunch of horsehair, between 8 to 19 was what we counted, and at the end made a little knot. Hold on, I'm going to show you the knot, because on the furthest there, that will create a little anchor for the weaving. Taking one hair out of the bunch, or two, we'll get back to that. Most of the hat here is one hair around the bunch, whereas the brim is 2 hairs around the brim. But that creates an anchor to start, and then you are slowly picking up around the straw, around the coil, the bunch, around the straw, and that creates this kind of circle on the outside, which makes the outside look kind of nice and even. And then the inside, you can see the straw and only the one horsehair coiling around. We were talking about the little kind of hole in the middle. At first, we weren't sure if that was a missing piece or if that was how it started. Most likely it is not a missing piece. That's the hole in the middle. That is where the joins for the straw come together, and you cannot weave any tighter than that before you start having to kind of pierce through the straw, and then you are ruining the structural integrity of the hat. So it does create this little kind of open hole where you can see a little braided straw or woven straw in the middle. So this is a work that takes a lot of time. Obviously, whoever made the original hat would probably have made more than one hat. It's something that it looks very, very neatly made, but it takes a long time. So for me, the biggest circles around take up to 45 minutes to do one round of horsehair, because you have to be perfectly even, push in the straw so that it's nice and neat. You have to feed in more straw to create the bigger. So we start with only 16, but obviously around I have to feed in more and more to create a bigger surface. And that's all very delicate work, because straw likes to break. You do have to prepare the straw first. The straw is wetted in warm, not boiling water, but warm water for about an hour and a half. You can use that bit of straw for up to 24 hours afterwards, so you don't, you can't wet too much straw at once, because then it gets brittle. That does mean that it became a little bit difficult when I needed to do the bends in the straw to create the shape. But I did manage to just re-wet the hat, laying it in a wet cloth, and then shape as I went while weaving. Now, we don't really know how they would have done the joins of the hat. The pieces could have been made separately and then put together, but there is no horsehair connecting the pieces differently than just around the coils. So for my reconstruction, I just continued it and just bent the straw to create the shape. Oh yeah, and you can see how beautiful this hat would have looked in sunlight. So the photo on the right there, or both of them, are taken in sunlight. And it looks really beautiful in person when the sun hits it and you get all the little colors from the horsehair. So it's a very, very nice decorative hat. For the top and the crown, both the top of the crown and the side of the crown, it is woven around with a single horsehair strand. However, for the top of the brim, but not the bottom of the brim, it is woven around with 2 strands. We don't know why. It could be for strength, it could be because the person who was doing it forgot. No idea, but it's probably for strength or to support or something like that. It's very neat and even all the way around. You can see a photo here of what it looks like on the inside, underneath, and that's where that single strand, the running weft, we've called it, goes underneath, and that's the only thing you see on the inside. Now, my little illustration here is because this hat is not quite finished. It still needs to get facing, and it needs to get just a couple more centimeters of the brim. This is a theory to how the facing and the brim is put together, because the horsehair the 2 pieces are separate, and with the material missing, we don't know how they were connected, but they were not connected by horsehair. So the brim and the facing, the ones who are lying together like that, they're not horsehair between them that has survived. So assuming that, I looked at other ways to tie them together and finish off a brim. So what I've kind of figured out is that the facing and the brim are made separately, the facing and the brim are put together, and then the straw is woven together to connect the 2 pieces, and that also creates a nice finished edge. This is how hats are made more modernly, with the kind of braiding in the little pieces. And that is complete speculation, but we are doing what we can. Yeah, so that's kind of what I've got, because hat is... Right. Okay, I'll take my little notebook.
That is fantastic, thank you. And you reckon it's for an adult?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Maybe.
Great, okay. Last little bit. So there's still a lot that we don't know. How did such a precious, well-made and durable hat end up in the wet? Did it blow off someone's head? Was it deposited deliberately? And horses must have been valued possessions at the time. Was this a high-status person? Or were such hats worn by lots of people? We just don't know. There are certainly other bits of evidence for people living in the area during the Late Bronze Age, including bronze artifacts. We've got pull staves, we've got a side loop spearhead. But there's still a lot still to find out about life in Kirtomy 3,000 years ago. So we'd like to thank the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for funding Lilja's fantastic replication work, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh for funding Susanna's fellowship. And there's a cast of thousands who have also helped us, including Babette's daughter and son. And last, by no means least, Caspar and Miri. Thanks for listening.